long line of contribution by many Chinese Americans. Most people don't think that way, but if we really go back, first of all, before we go into the contribution, let us agree on a definition, as I always do. What is Chinese American and what's the difference between that and American Chinese? Okay, so I am answering a question in the context that any ethnic Chinese with an American affiliation had made contribution. Why is it important? Because, for example, Dr. Sun Yat-sen was never an American citizen, but he lived in America for a long time. And he made a tremendous contribution to China, and as a result, impacted America very much by creation, a new Republic of China that eventually has an impact on foreign policy in the United States and go through Henry Luce and all those, okay? And there's another person that I don't think many people know about, but Jim Tian-yo. He is a guy who invented the railroad couplings. You know what that is, right? Two cars in a coach. He's Chinese American who invented that and who was never given a whole lot of credit. He is an engineer that was, graduate from American universities. And then if you think about Dr. Chun Shih-hsian, who participated in the Manhattan Project and helped America build an atomic bomb. He's American, Chinese, okay? And then you also talk about Dr. Wen-ho Lee, because of the case of his forced arrest that woke up the civil rights, the knowledge about for a lot of Americans, and goes on. And if you come to more current, years, the like of Ambassador Juliet Block, who went on, even though she be the first Chinese American ambassador, but after she left office, she spent a lot of time and effort behind the scene, creating classes and improving understanding between U.S. Senior officials and about the Chinese people and Chinese culture. And then talk about thousands of railroad workers who was never recognized when they built the Transcontinental Railroad. Many of them died without even their name being recorded. And then think about all the hundreds and thousands of Chinese in this country who work in restaurants and laundries. I always joke that for decades, the ethnic Chinese in this country fed America and wash all the clothes. I mean, these are menial jobs, but they become a very important fabric of the American history and American building of the country. So if you look at that, and you look at, more recently politically, you go to California, look at Madame Florence Fang, who created all these things that trying to improve the American image of China, for Chinese, for the museum that she created in San Francisco. And as well as when she took over became the first Chinese to own a major newspaper, the San Francisco Examiner. I can go on. So there are a lot of these things that go on that are not, in my opinion, documented in an organized way. That's very sad. But on the other hand, think of all the college professors in this country who are Chinese, American Chinese, educated the next young generation, right? If you go to Silicon Valley these days, all the Chinese and Chinese Americans or American Chinese became the backbone of that industry. If you go to I live in Maryland, so near where I am, there's called Interstate 270. You look at all those biopharma, all the human genome companies, a lot of them are owned, staffed, and operate by ethnic Chinese. And that become the backbone of a major industry in this country. So I can go on. So the contribution is substantial, is pervasive, and extremely important and strategic to the growth of this country, but never properly documented or organized. In order to understand things like this, you have to understand American history. Okay? This country was founded by immigrants continuously, built by immigrants, and continuously fed and nourished by immigrants. However, it has been this country's practice and tradition to be extremely xenophobic, meaning fear of foreigners. When the Pilgrims came from England, they left England because they did not have religious freedom. So what did they do as soon as they came to America? They killed and burned at stake anybody who don't believe in their own religion. That's the hunting of the witches, right? So this is based on this kind of tradition the country is founded. So every new group of immigrant that came to this country had always been treated extremely poorly and harshly. Most people don't realize that, but especially new arrival Chinese, when the Irish first came here, they were treated worse than the Chinese today. And then the later Germans and then Italians were treated very poorly by those who came before them. And then the Greeks, and then so forth and so on, right? So, and then in this country, because of influx of Chinese during the railroad construction, and because of later, a lot of it, and I'll talk about this in a minute later, a lot of these are self-inflicted injury. Because of the immigration restriction, a lot of Chinese engage in illegal immigration, especially during the early days of this country. So long and short of that is it created a very negative image. And then when they came to this country, they lived together because of discrimination, so to speak, or because of cultural differences, and also because of economic disadvantage. They live in Chinatown. Now, the hygiene and living standard in China is very different than Europe. So when people look at Chinatown, they just came to the impression that these are not full human beings. How can people live like that? So a lot of, I'm not blaming those ancestors of ours. They had to deal with what they had to deal with, but a lot of these were created because of circumstance. And long and short of that is, over time, if you look at every ethnic group, and most people don't realize, until about 50 years ago, there was a lot of open discrimination against Jews in this country. To this day, there's still a huge under-sentiment of anti-Semitism. So it's not targeting the Chinese, it's just targeting people who are different. And it is part of this DNA of this country. I'm not saying it's right, but this is the way this country is. But the good news is, if you look at every group who got really treated poorly and badly, they all came out okay once they passed through that passage. For example, the blacks were brought over here against their will. They were actually kidnapped in Africa and brought over as slaves. And for generations, they were treated like animals, right? But now we had a black president, we have General Colin Powell, we have Condoleezza Rice, and the current defense chief is African American, right? And the vice president is African American. So every group came out okay when President John F. Kennedy ran for president. This is in the 60s. Most Americans had questioned about Catholics. Should we allow Catholics to become president? Because what if they do something they call the Pope first? Are they loyal to America? This is 1960s when I first came to America. And so right now, our President Biden is openly Catholic. Nobody made an issue of it. So these two shall pass. But so that's one side, historical factors. The other thing too is I always believe a lot of the problem that Chinese American, as other groups too, faces are self-inflicted because of self-marginalization and failure to understand properly the need to mainstream. I always joke that many Chinese friends of mine are still suffering from this syndrome called 身在美国，心在大陆. The body is in America, but the heart and the mind is still back in China. That is very natural. I mean, that's understandable, but that is what marginalizes yourself. And I always ask my Chinese friends, what friends who are Chinese, could be, green card holder, could be visa holders, or could be American citizens. How many of your friends are true friends? In Beijing, they call 哥们, right? Or 闺蜜. How many of your 哥们, 闺蜜 are African Americans? How many of your 闺蜜 and 哥们 are Latinos? I bet you probably not, a whole lot. So if the fact that the answer was, oh, I work with white people, I work with black people. I said, that's not what it is, okay? When was the last time you have a black family in your home for dinner? When was the last time you went out, I don't know what you do, bowling or whatever, karaoke with a Latino, Latina, right? These are kind of things that are self-imposed barrier that did not allow us to be fully integrated. And I think that's very sad. If you look at most of the Chinese American Chinese who have done well in this country, they basically went in and become fully integrated without forsaking the cultural heritage. That's the balance people need to learn, especially new immigrants. So a lot of these so-called anti-Chinese sentiments Part of it is historic, part of it is structural. In this country, it's not going to change. I can guarantee you that. So then the other part is self-inflicted. We can control the self-infliction. So at the end of the day, I always said, when God gives you a lemon, you have two choices. Either you create lemonade and sell them for profit, or you sit there and cry about being sour. And the rest is up to us. And I will end this answer with this story. I always said, Condoleezza Rice grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. For those people who are familiar with American geography and history, Birmingham is probably the epicenter of racial bigotry and discrimination back then. She grew up in that environment. So when she became Secretary of State, she was interviewed by a reporter and say, how did you, a Black woman, came out of Birmingham, became the Secretary of State? And I never forgot what she said. She said, my parent has always taught me, do not let Birmingham's limitation be your limitation. So we came here with our skin color different. We came here with different cultural heritage. We came here with all kinds of baggages. And the US-China relationship doesn't help us. But if we allow that to become our own limitation, as the Americans saying, the only obstacle between you and success is really yourself.